Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We welcome you today to our conversation. This is one of a series of 7 conversations that have happened across the state. And the time is now to put Minnesota children first. And so we welcome you to the conversation today. I am Bukata Hayes, Vice President for Racial and Health Equity at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota. This is a new position and a new role at Blue Cross Blue Shield Minnesota. And it's meant to address what we declared as a public health crisis, and that's racism, and how racism impacts many components of our life. And so my task, along with a great group of folks at Blue Cross Blue Shield Minnesota, is to do something about racism as a public health crisis. And that includes the focus of our conversation today, race and education. This is the 7th in a series that the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the Minnesota Humanities Center, and former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Page have been doing across Minnesota. Minnesota is growing more diverse each year. Our education gaps are also growing. The pandemic has been hard on our kids, families, teachers and staff, and our schools. So you've been in these communities listening, learning, challenging what we do to serve an increasingly diverse student body and ensure that all children are included and given the opportunity to reach their full potential. You've been on the road visiting communities such as Duluth, Mankato, Bemidji, Fergus Falls, Moorhead, and St. Cloud, talking about race and education. And so I'm curious for each of you to share and reflect a little bit together and sort of share your learnings, sort of what you've been hearing, what you've been seeing thus far. And then also, of course, we want to talk about solutions. So as we get started today, I'll ask that each of you, Justice Page, Neel, Kevin, to introduce yourself, share why education is so important to you. And so what we'll do is we'll start with Justice Page.
Well, thank you. Why is education important to me? Because it is the foundation on which everything I have done is built. And the reality is that it's the foundation for everyone to achieve their hopes and dreams. It's the foundation that allows them to be their fullest self. I first was interested in this topic when I started playing football, and as a young child of 14, 15-year-old, I would be asked to talk because of my football playing, I would be asked to talk to young people about the value and importance of education. And I would do that. But at the same time, I would see football players. I grew up in Canton, Ohio. Football is pretty important there. I'd see football players who were stars in high school, had gone on to college and been successful playing football there, but end up back in Canton unemployed and unemployable. And I couldn't understand this conflict, if you will, between academics and athletics. Ultimately, I concluded that this was an academic problem and not an athletic problem. And so I've been thinking about and talking to young people about the importance and the value of education since then. Started the Page Education Foundation in 1988 with my late wife, Diane, with the goal of encouraging, motivating, and assisting young men and women of color. We are at a point where if we don't solve the education problems we have, particularly with respect to the disparities, as a society, we are going to fail because we can't continue to have only 25 to 30% of young men and women of color poor white children operating at a some substandard level academically. We have to change. And so I've been committed to trying to do what I could to make that change for quite a while.
Thank you, Justice Page. We'll go to Kevin Lindsey with the Minnesota Humanities Center. Your response to the prompt, why is education so important to you? Also introduce yourself, if you will.
Thank you, Bukata. Really appreciate you serving as a moderator today. It's really a privilege and an honor to be on this conversation and tour with Justice Page and Minneapolis President Fed Chair Neel Kashkari. My name is Kevin Lindsey. I serve as the CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. I have been in this position a little over 2 years. For those unfamiliar with the Minnesota Humanities Center, it's an affiliate connected with the National Endowment for the Humanities, but it serves as an independent nonprofit organization in Minnesota. And we seek to amplify, utilize the humanities to realize our vision, which is a just society that is curious, connected, and compassionate. And my feeling about education is similar to the way in which Justice Page stated it. I don't have the personal story because it's really my father's story of when he was in 4th grade and being informed by one of his math teachers that he didn't have the math aptitude to become a pilot, and how that stayed with him. It didn't deter him ultimately from working at United Airlines, but he didn't ascribe to being a pilot, but he did describe being somebody in computer programming and ultimately in IT. And as someone who benefited from his learning and love of logic and being able to be taught chess at the age of 5, I appreciated how education can be powerful in both ways. It can open doors for you when you have a good teacher, but it also can hurt one's spirit if you have the wrong teacher. But there's a lot of resilience within the community. And I think for myself, I look at trying to ensure that we have the best and the brightest, and we have an educational system that's uplifting and inspiring for all students. And I hope that the Minnesota Humanities Center with education institutes with Teach for Teachers, working on curriculum development within schools, participating, facilitating parent engagement can help ensure that we have the best education system that we can have in the entire country. The problem, however, is, as Justice Page alluded to, we don't. We have significant disparities as it relates to children of color and children with disabilities. And we now need to really bring urgency to it.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. We'll turn to Neel. Please introduce yourself and then also your response to why is education so important to you.
Thank you, Bukata, and thank you, my colleagues, Justice Page and Kevin Lindsey. Great to be on this journey with all of you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Neel Kashkari. I'm president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I've been in this role for just over 6 years now. Let me just say 2 quick things. First is, why is it personally important to me? It's very interesting to hear Justice Page and Kevin talk about their own upbringing and their own personal stories. Each of us has our own unique story that has brought us to this point. For me, my parents were immigrants from India. Now, I was very fortunate. I was born in Akron, Ohio, actually not far from where Justice Page was born by coincidence. But because my parents were educated, they insisted that my sister and me get a good education. And because we did get a good education, I feel like every door of this country has been open to me. Here I am, first generation son of immigrants, not a remarkable family, and I'm getting to be a Federal Reserve Bank president. I mean, this is a remarkable country, but the key to unlocking that opportunity is education. And so it's important to me because I just think I've been so fortunate and so blessed because I had those doors open to me because of my education. I think it's a tragedy that so many young people are not getting the same opportunity and are being left behind. Now, why is the Minneapolis Fed, why do we care as an institution about this issue? We were created by Congress in 1913, and the United States Congress assigns us our goals and our responsibilities. One of the goals that they've assigned to us is what we call maximum employment, as many Americans as possible, employed, contributing to our economy, able to provide for themselves and their families. Why is that so important? It's so important for the economic vibrancy, economic potential and for society as a whole. And as we've analyzed this, we've realized that the single most important determinant to anybody's success in the job market are the skills you have and the education that you received. And if we are systematically leaving behind large percentages of our population, not only are those individuals and their families affected by it, but our economy's potential is affected by it and is held back because of it. And so for more than 20 years, the Minneapolis Fed has done pioneering work on the value of early childhood education, getting to kids early. And the work we're doing with Justice Page and Kevin on the Page Amendment builds on that legacy that we're very proud of. And so we don't set education policy. We're not here to say this is what a curriculum should be. We are simply here to articulate why it is so important for our economy's potential that we close these gaps and we give every young person in Minnesota a good chance to reach their full potential. Last little housekeeping note I'll just mention, at the Federal Reserve, we have certain periods of time when we are in a quiet period. I'm in the quiet period now, which means I'm not allowed to talk about the outlook for the economy. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I can talk generically about why an educated workforce is so important to our long-term potential. Thank you, Bukata.
Thank you, Neel. Thank you all for your introductions and your response to that. We'll move right into the questions. So we have some questions today, just so folks get a sort of a lay of the land. We have some questions that we will ask Justice Page, Kevin, and Neel, ask them to respond to. We do have an opportunity to submit questions for our panelists to respond to. And so as we work through the sort of preset questions that we have, we'll try and make time to get to those questions and answers too for those who are attending. So to that first question, you've toured the state during a pandemic, meeting with superintendents, community leaders, locally elected officials, and young people. In this ever-evolving pandemic, what did you notice about the impacts of distance learning, the pressures on students, educators, and administrators, and how this has impacted our conversation, right, in your work on race in education? And so with, we'll start with Kevin, then we'll go to Justice Page, and then we'll go to Neel. So Kevin.
Thank you, Bukata. This has been an incredibly trying period of time for teachers, administrators, and all who seek to support education within our state. The uncertainty as to what is necessary as to provide adequate safety for staff and for students has been trying. The idea of the consistency of communication of curriculum and teaching to students has been evolving and challenging. And then I would say, because we have been the epicenter of a horrible tragedy, the murder of Mr. George Floyd, and the emotional tumult that has really caused all of us to experience as we seek to really create justice for all within our society, it has been an incredibly difficult time for teachers and for students. What I have been amazed by in the tour is, despite all of this, is that there are teachers, there are administrators that are seeking to do better and to reach and to address the historical disparities. We just had an opportunity to have a visit with folks in Cloquet. In my former position as a commissioner of the Department of Human Rights, we had found that there had been some disparities as it relates to the suspension rate of Indigenous students. It was very heartwarming to know 2 years after leaving the office that that work has continued and they have been able to do some things differently and achieve levels of success as to what they're doing on suspensions. Now, I wish I could say across the board that disparities of high school graduation and achievement as it relates to students performing better on tests and other indicators, some indicators of success have been improving. Unfortunately, we have not seen that uniformly throughout the state. So the need still remains. It's a very difficult time. Folks are working hard. And I think we all need to express gratitude for what's happening, but also be intentional and continue this work ahead. As Justice Page said, we just don't have enough students that are graduating at the levels to be able to have a long-term success for our economy and our region. it has to be a top priority for us.
Yeah, very good. Justice Page.
Well, I can only echo what Kevin said and would point out that these times are really challenging for everybody. I spend some time when I'm permitted at Justice Page Middle School in Minneapolis. And the pressures that students are under, the pressures that the staff is under, the teachers are under, the administrators are under, it's almost unbearable. But yet, day in and day out, they are all there doing the best they can to normalize the education process. And I don't know how you normalize a process when from one day to the next, you're losing students, you're losing teachers, you're losing staff members. You don't know from one day to the next who's in and who's out. But they are there day in and day out doing what they need to do. The other thing I would note, and it's significant, I believe in 2019, I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but for reading and math scores, about, I believe it was in the 60s, maybe the mid 60s% of students were at grade level. And this is overall, this is no specific group. Overall, somewhere in the mid 60s. For 2020, the first year of the pandemic, that number dropped to I think 52%. Reading and math scores performing at grade level. That is a clear showing that this pandemic is having an effect. And the disparities have not gotten better simply because the numbers dropped. The effect is on everybody.
Yeah, great thoughts, Justice Page. Neel.
Thank you. Let me echo what Kevin and Justice Page said. People are working tirelessly in an incredibly uncertain environment and doing their very best. Everyone's just trying to get through. So on one hand, it's remarkable what's been accomplished, the massive adjustments in how education is being delivered, and there's a lot to be celebrated. But the disparities, as Justice Page was just saying, have only gotten worse. We've seen so many examples of if a school district was shut because of COVID fears, families of means oftentimes shifted their children to a private school that was open, or they got tutors, or they got other support. And so the disparities that existed before the pandemic, I mean, I don't think the data is complete yet. My sense is they massively expanded during the pandemic. And the difference is which families had the means to provide their own support that their children needed and other families that didn't have it. And so I think people have worked really hard, done their very best in unbelievably trying circumstances, but these problems have gotten worse.
Yeah, great point, Neel. And I mean, intuitively, right? If you have means, it means it translates to I have a device that I can actually go virtual for virtual learning. I have internet access, reliable internet access that allows me to engage with my other students and my teacher in a way that enables the education process to really take hold. And then to your point of if a public school were to have to shut down to control sort of the COVID numbers, again, some parents who had means then saw other opportunities to some of our private schools who may have still been open at that time. And so I would agree with you just in terms of the landscape, at least here in southern Minnesota, that they did worsen. And I think we also have some data nationwide that shows that too, right? That these gaps did worsen over this pandemic. Kevin?
No, I was going to just concur with that. And I think sometimes when we think about it being binary, either you have capability, IT capability or not, but really there's a whole range even within that spectrum, because we know that there are some households that greatly expand the demand for the IT bandwidth, greatly expanded, right? And they might not have had the financial capital wherewithal to be able to meet that, right? So it clearly was a time in which there was a separation of some of the haves to the have-nots, or the not as much. And I think this is why these conversations are critically important, because it could be very easy for us just simply to say, we are now on the other side of the pandemic and we just go from where we are, as opposed to bringing a level of leadership and intentionality to shore up the deficit that was created and recommit ourselves to addressing the disparity that existed prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, great point, great point. Any other closing thoughts on this question from Justice Page, Neel, Kevin, as we move into the next question? All right. So then the next question, and for each of you, what was the single sort of biggest either surprise or takeaway that you had from the conversations in community in regard to race and education?
Well, for me, it is that Minnesota has become increasingly diverse in places that you wouldn't imagine. One of our visits was to Pelican Rapids. Their schools are 60% students of color. And we had a visit to Bemidji, to an elementary school there. And I did some reading to a couple of classes. One of the classes was, I would say, 90+% students of color. And when you think about those, I mean, there were 30, 35 students. You take 27% of those, they're the only ones that are performing at grade level. Not that those individuals fit that profile, but when you see it in person and you think about it, it is shocking that we tolerate where we are today in terms of these disparities. And that's why it's critically important that we change the system that has systematically left so many children behind. We're at a point where we can't afford to continue to tinker around the edges. The foundation is about to collapse, and we can't just shore it up. We have to rebuild it.
Yeah, fantastic point. And just love the nuance there of where we're seeing our sort of diverse classrooms grow. So I know when we think about diversity in classroom, most folks would probably zero in on the metro, right? Or maybe Absolutely. It's like Rochester or Mankato or Duluth or St. Cloud. And then what we find is even in smaller communities, a Worthington, a St. James, a Pelican Rapids, a Faribault, we're also seeing that diversity in a classroom grow. Thus the urgency that you spoke to, Justice Page. And so in my haste to get to responses, I forgot to lay out the response order for this question. So it was Justice Page, which intuitively, I guess instinctively, you knew you were next up. And then I'll go to Neel, and then I'll go to Kevin. So Neel?
Yeah, I would add a few things. One is, not a complete surprise, but everywhere we went, people across the state of Minnesota care about education. They really value it intuitively. It's high on their priority list. Number one. Number two, Minnesota has told itself that it's great for a long time. So a lot of people across the state are shocked when you can put the data in front of them. And we actually have a data tool on the Minneapolis Fed's website. So you can go to your own school district And you can click a button and you can see how your own school district is actually performing, how many kids are actually at grade level, and slice the data however you'd like. And so people are shocked when they discover how bad these gaps are. And they're even more shocked when we say we're some of the worst in the nation. You know, sometimes you meet people and they'll say, oh, well, this is a problem everywhere. It's poverty, it's this or that. No, Minnesota is doing worse than most states in America on these dimensions. And there's certainly racial disparities, but low-income white kids are also being badly served by our education system. And so when we've put this data out there in front of people across the state to see, they're taken aback by it. And then they're saying, okay, you know, we have to do something dramatic because this is not okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the whole idea of poverty, unfortunately, in too many of our minds is associated solely with people of color. Poverty exists throughout all races. And I think the shocking thing on this tour for folks within community is that people believe that folks that are impacted by poverty in the state of Minnesota somehow are doing better than in other states. So when you're laying out the data and you're seeing that folks that are in poverty in the state of Minnesota are among the worst in the country, that's so a cognitive dissonance for folks. And it is something, I think, as leaders, that folks are wanting to turn around, wanting to do different. I think the other thing from the tour that I really appreciated was the diverse books that Justice Page read within classrooms. There was a hunger and a thirst for that. I think, folks, we all need to embrace the idea that there is actually an opportunity to do things differently, to experiment, to innovate, if we're willing to be courageous to do so. But it takes, a tipping point of people within school districts. And I think this impetus here can embolden other folks to take even more strides to do things differently within their school district.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. And just a little bit of expansion too. I mean, in terms of sort of diverse books, right? And I think about it in terms of diverse teachers, right? Diverse curriculum. That also, right? Because I know some of the hesitation by some in Minnesota but what about white students, right? And what they find is that white students also benefit from having diverse teachers, diverse reading materials, right? Diverse curriculum. And so I think to even further expand to your point, Kevin, like that diverse reading options or diverse curriculum helps and benefits all students, while especially showing students of color to be in the picture, right? To see themselves in the process, to see themselves in curriculum that also helps to move forward the education. I see Neel, you okay. So
I'm sorry, if I could just add one, you just hit on a key point. When we've looked at other states that are doing much better than Minnesota in lifting up their children of color and their low-income white children, what's fascinating is not only have the low-income students and the kids of color done much better in terms of their education and performance and then their career options, all students have actually ended up doing much better. So some people say, well, this is a finite pie, and if you help these students, then my kids are going to lose. That's completely wrong. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about knowledge. You can share knowledge widely, and it doesn't come at anybody's expense. And there is absolute data from other states that all of their students have done better because they've been able to reach more and help them to succeed.
Yeah, great point.
Can I just jump in and analogize to my experience on the court? Our Supreme Court has 7 members. And while I was there was a diversity of experience among the people who were there. And what I found was that the richness of that diversity not only made what I did better, it made what everybody did better. And the same is true in the classroom, in virtually all walks of life. And I learn from others' experiences. They learn from mine. And that learning makes us all better. And the same is certainly true when it comes to education. This notion that there is benefit for one and not for another. And so we don't want to benefit A because it'll have a negative impact on B. It's just nonsense. Both A and B benefit.
Yeah, very good. Kevin, I know you were going to jump in there too.
Oh, what I was going to say, one thing that came out within the tour was sort of this conversation, building on this point of sort of languages, right? So there are a host of families within Minnesota that are seeking to have their children learn Chinese or Spanish or another language. But when we have kids within our school systems now, that's their primary language, which they speak at home, another language, somehow that's a detriment. How do we see the individual child for the gifts that they have and create space for that child to realize their full potential? And by the way, as Justice Page, so eloquently articulated, when that child is able to give its gifts and to share, all those around that child benefit from that, and they learn and are enhanced. And now their world expands. So we just have to, I think, really center that idea. It's not zero sum, as Neel says, and learning is a beautiful gift that can be shared and expands the bounds of all those who come in touch with it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for your responses. I know we won't talk about it today, but I think maybe when we get to the question and answer, it might be important to speak to it. In terms of, there is a movement now, and just something for us to think about, maybe respond to the question and answer. There is a movement now not to include, I'll say it this way, sort of diverse perspectives when it comes to history that is being taught, right, within our curriculum. And so just want you to sort of mull that over. Would love to hear sort of your response to that, right? What do we do to sort of address sort of a recent surge of complaints that teaching a full, diverse history from multiple perspectives isn't beneficial within our schools? And so we'll give you some time to think about that, because I know I kind of sprung that on you. We'll move to the next question. And so you may be able to answer that in this too. That question I just posed within this response, and that is, what will need to change? What's working? What is one solution that we can implement now that will create real and lasting change? So what will we need to change? What do you see as working? What is one real solution that we can implement now that will create real and lasting change? And for this, we'll start with Neel. We'll go to Justice Page, and then we'll finish up with Kevin. Neel?
Well, I would just say, I'm not, and I'm sure Kevin and Justice Page would say the same. I'm not an educator, so I'm not here in a position to say this should be the curriculum, this should be the class size, this should be how we teach individual students. The teachers and principals and parents are the ones in the best position to decide that. But I do know what we've been doing now for decades has not worked. And as we've analyzed it, what we've been doing now is rooted in the Constitution of the state of Minnesota, which has a provision on education that says that young people have the right to access an adequate education system. Well, what does that mean, an adequate education system? It's a system that is on average adequate. Well, who wishes for an adequate education for their children? And by the way, if the system is adequate, your children may be at the top of that system in a grade school, or the bottom of that system. The average is adequate. And so when we looked at that with Justice Page, we realized the Minnesota education system today is performing exactly as the Constitution has described it more than 150 years ago. And so, the one change that we have been talking a lot about is changing that constitution to modernize it like many other states have and say that, you know what, the children in Minnesota deserve a quality education. And this should be the state's highest priority on delivering that. And so that is a systematic change that could support all sorts of innovation from teachers and parents and school board members and principals to customize the education that their own children need. So that's what I would be here to talk about. And I know Justice Page agrees with that, but they may have other perspectives as well.
Well, I do agree with that, Neel. And I would just point out, you know, our current constitutional language is from 1857. It was not designed nor intended to benefit children, poor children, or children of color. That was not its goal. It was also not designed to deal with the world as it has changed. We live in an entirely different world than existed in 1857. And that foundation is currently disserving us all. And so we would make education a civil right and make a quality public education a civil right, so that we start educating individual children and not focusing so much on the system. We spend all of our time talking about and worrying about what the system is doing. We need to start educating the children that are in the classroom and not some average child that the system is evidently intended to produce. And when we do that, when we focus on giving every child what they need to grow and develop, we put them in the position to achieve and to reach and to become their best and highest self. And from that, we all benefit.
It echoes of what's said. We have been blessed to have 3 children, and we give each child what they need. That might be a little different from one son to the next, but we give them what they need. So why can't we, as a society, make that commitment to all of our beautiful daughters and sons that are in schools throughout the state? That's a transformation on our thinking, and that would lead to, I believe, to different outcomes of where we're going. You asked the question, you teased this as to history, right? We need to embrace our history. We need to understand that just because something has happened in the past doesn't mean that we're, in talking about it, castigating our fellow citizens in the present moment. But it is important to understand the past, dare us forget and repeat maybe potential mistakes of the past. So for this conversation, which is going on around the country, let us be bold, let us set a mark for other states to follow, that we are not fearful of talking about our history. We want the best educated children, and we don't do that when we close off topics to them.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. We do have, so one, thank you for your responses. We do have one question from the audience, and it refers to something that we were talking to a little bit earlier. And so I'll read the question, and then for responses, I'll go Justice Page, Neel, and then Kevin. So the question was, how do you respond to those who argue that the reason that students of color do poorly is because they have no one at home who can help them? So how do you respond to that sort of inquiry? We'll start with Justice Page, we'll go to Neel, and then we'll go to Kevin.
Well, I respond by noting that that really is an argument that says those children can't learn. And I categorically reject that. Just because you come from a family that has challenges, just because you grow up in poverty, doesn't mean that you can't learn. We have to maybe teach them in a different way. It's a little like successful football teams. Successful football teams.
Hey, Alan, we lost your video.
I know. Hold on one second here.
There we go.
Making us jealous with those grandbabies, though.
Successful football teams are the ones that take the talents of the players that come in the door and adapt their system to those talents. The teams that fail are the teams that impose the system on the people that come in the door. The same is true for education. We can educate them, but we have to we have to educate the people that are there, not the people that we would like to be there. And that will require us to change how we think and how we act. But I categorically reject the contention that poor children from challenged families can't learn. And I would note that in the states where the disparities are not as bad as ours, they have dysfunctional families. They have poor children. They have children from poor families. So I simply reject the argument. And it's incumbent upon us to figure out how we educate those children, not place the burden on them and say, well, you come from a challenged background, and so we can't help you.
Neel?
There's nothing I can add. I think Alan covered it very well.
Kevin?
I would agree. I would agree.
All right, so we have another question. Question is, how do I respond to those who say the amendment will result in a spate of lawsuits? And how does the amendment define quality education? So quote unquote quality education. So again, we'll go, this time we'll go Neel, Kevin, and then Justice Page. So, or maybe I'll reverse that. We'll go with Justice Page since the amendment bears your name, Justice. So we'll start with you. How do I respond to those who say the amendment will result in a spat of lawsuits? And then how does the amendment define quality education?
Well, let me begin with how the amendment defines quality. An education that fully prepares children with the skills necessary for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. That is how we will define and measure quality. So the amendment speaks to it itself. Lawsuits. Well, we have lawsuits today. I don't know that there would be an increase in lawsuits. Indeed, in other states that have amended their state constitutions, there haven't been any increase in lawsuits. The other thing I would point out is that we are fortunate in Minnesota to have a strong and impartial judiciary. They call balls and strikes. We don't have a judiciary that has judges who are there to impose their will as opposed to exercise their judgment. Courts make decisions, and however long it might take litigation to play itself out, at the end of that litigation, a court will have made a decision from which we can build and go forward. As we stand today, I mean, as I say, I've been focused on this issue for well more than 50 years. Litigation has gone on. It hasn't brought about change. That's because in many cases, the litigation spends its time litigating whether they can litigate. By creating the civil right, that answers that question. Not only that, it lays out the parameters of what the litigation can be about and whether or not that right is being fulfilled. So that doesn't trouble me one bit. And indeed, as I say, courts make decisions, and from those decisions, we can go forward.
Thank you. We'll go to Neel and then go to Kevin.
You know, the only two quick things I would add. One is, it's very interesting that Attorney General Ellison, whose job it is to defend the state against lawsuits, is a strong supporter of the Page Amendment. And that's because he sees what's happening in the education system in Minnesota. And he also doesn't think it's going to lead to an increase in litigation, but it can lead to major policy changes, which are sorely needed in the state. And then the second thing, and Justice Page alluded to this, if you look at the history of our country, there have been some really important lawsuits that have taken place. Brown versus Board of Education, a seminal court case that led to the end of state-sponsored segregation across the country. And so to just say, we don't want any litigation, well, sure, let's do the right thing. But if we are unable to do the right thing because of political barriers, having that courts be able to step in if a family feels like their child's rights are being violated, that is an important catalyst for change.
Yeah, I would echo
Yeah.
both what Justice Page and Neel have said. And I want to amplify a little bit of what Justice Page has said about where we're spending most of our time. We're spending most of our time litigating the question of, can we actually litigate these issues of disparities? So in my capacity as a former commissioner of human rights for the state of Minnesota, when we were taking a look at disparities concerning suspensions, that wasn't that the first argument made by attorneys representing school districts wasn't that we don't have bad disparities. They all acknowledge that. The first and only argument for many school districts was, you don't have the authority to be able to litigate this question. So to me, we have to reframe where we are. And unfortunately, some within our society have trained us to hear more litigation is the same as frivolous litigation. And there's a big difference between litigation and frivolous litigation. I want litigation which ensures that people have human rights. I want people to be educated. I want people not to starve. I want people not to have their criminal rights where they're violated. I want those things. What I don't want in a society is frivolous litigation. So I think if we're spending our time just getting to the door, let's not be so overly concerned at this point concerning this, that it might increase litigation.
Absolutely, great point. So we have two more audience questions, and then we want to leave some time for each of you to provide some closing thoughts as well. So it's about 4:49. I know we have until 5 o'clock. And so just wanted to provide that time check as we move into the third question from the audience. And it again goes back to something we talked about earlier in terms of the pressures that this pandemic in particular have been putting upon students, teachers, educational leaders, schools and school districts. and families. So it says mental health issues in education is a big topic of discussion and concern these days. I often hear about the Page Amendment as a tool to address disparities in education for students of color and poor whites. How will the Page Amendment help schools and kids? So in particular, to some of those other sort of gaps that we might see in education, how will the Page Amendment help schools and kids address other gaps that we may see in education as well? And then again, just the opening reference was around mental health issues right now. So I will start with Kevin, I'll go to Neel, and then I'll go to Justice Page.
Well, I will say this, and I'll leave it to Neel and Justice Page to really talk about and hone in on how the Page Amendment specifically. We need to have the conversation as it relates to mental health care. A lot of medical healthcare professionals, I've heard this number anywhere between 15 and 25% would say that folks are clinically depressed because of all the issues surrounding the current pandemic. So this is a huge issue for us as a society in which to deal with. What I'm hearing within the classroom is opportunities for teachers and administrators to be better connected with services. But again, that towel is being wrung as tight as it can be. But I think schools holistically better utilizing the resources that are in and around them, schools are doing that. I'm hopeful that these conversations are going to lead to a more holistic way of funding and provide more flexibility, because we are going to need mental health services for quite some time at a different level than what we have currently provided for schools. The one last thing before I turn it over to the piece that I heard from a lot of school districts outside of the metro area was that they were surprised that, again, about how it was based on property as opposed to the needs of their kids. And if it's on property value, they will always be behind in that race. So reframing it to center it on kids is a recipe for a winning solution for all within the state.
Thank you. Neel?
The amendment by design is not detailed. It doesn't say this should be class size or this should be the instruction, and it is not one size fits all. Basically, what it means is each child in Minnesota should get the support and the education that they need to reach their full potential. So for some students and in some communities, more mental health resources is absolutely going to be part of the solution. For others, it may be better access to online tools. For others, it may be more focusing on internships or apprenticeships. The key is let the individual schools with the parents and teachers together determine what those kids need in order to be successful. And is mental health going to be part of that? For some students, absolutely. But the key is allow that innovation and that customization to take place rather than saying, hey, every school in Minnesota needs to look identical. By the way, they don't today, but they're in theory supposed to. And it's one size fits all for every student.
And I don't think I could say it any better than Neel just said it.
All right. So we have one last question before we will wrap up, and that is, how will the Page Amendment change the discussion to include Greater Minnesota at the table for all discussions and funding opportunities? The essence of that, I believe, is speaking to sort of the gravitational pull that we know the metro in our state has. And so when we talk about these things we typically sort of focus in on the metro. I would say by your tour, you have been including Greater Minnesota in that conversation when you think about Mankato, Bemidji, Fergus Falls, Moorhead, and St. Cloud, Duluth. But how will the Page Amendment change the discussion to include Greater Minnesota? And so I'll start with Justice Page. I'll go to Kevin and then Neel.
I would just simply say all children means all children. It means urban children. It means suburban children. It means children from Greater Minnesota. It means all children. It means Black children, other children of color, Indigenous children, disabled children, wealthy children, poor children. all children means all children. And so those children in greater Minnesota, they have a civil right also. And by the way, they are being left behind.
Right. Thank you. Kevin.
I don't think I have anything to add to what Justice Page said there.
All right, we'll go to Neel.
All I would add is what's so exciting about the Page Amendment is where the support for it is coming from. If you look at the bill authors in the House and Senate, it's a combination of Democrats of color from the Twin Cities and conservative Republicans from greater Minnesota, because those members are saying, hey, our kids are being left behind by this school system that is systematically disadvantaging them. And so I think that it's exciting because elected leaders on both sides of the aisle have realized how this can directly affect the kids in their districts, in their towns. And so it is by design, designed to encompass the entire state, not some, all, just as Alan said.
Thank you so much. We have time for, it's now time for closing remarks. So we will start with Justice Page, we will go to Neel, and then we'll go to Kevin. Justice Page.
Well, for me, at the end of the day, this is about justice, educational justice. And the reality is that there is a direct link between educational justice, housing justice, social justice, racial justice, health justice. Those things are all linked. We have the opportunity to change the future by giving every child a civil right to an education that will allow them to achieve their highest self. And when we do that, we give those children choices. They get to decide what their future will be. And from that, I think we all benefit. The reality is when we leave children behind, they become a diminished employee, a diminished taxpayer, less able to contribute to our communities, and quite likely, and the opportunity for them to become a burden for our communities increases. By creating that civil right, we can change the future to the benefit of all of us.
Thank you, Justice Page. Neel.
I couldn't add anything. I thought Justice Page summarized it masterfully, other than to say, learn more about it. There's a lot of information on minneapolisfed.org. There's that data tool where you can look at the education disparities yourself. Just get informed. A lot of people are surprised when they hear this, and I think the more informed we all are, the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Neel. Kevin.
So on behalf of everyone at the Minnesota Humanities Center, we really appreciate being part of these conversations and the ongoing efforts to ensure that education is provided for all, that meets them where they are. Within the National Endowment of the Humanities, there's a line within the enabling statute that a democracy demands the wisdom of its citizens. So it really is, from a personal standpoint, from a larger society standpoint, critically important that every person is fully educated to their full capacity. They're strong individuals, strong local communities, and then a strong country. And we're really committed to making sure that that happens.
I want to thank each of you for being on the panel today, sharing your thoughts, insights from your statewide tour in support of the Page Amendment, and specifically to talk pretty candidly to race and education today. I simply end with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? We just recently had the commemoration of his life on this holiday. I end with this quote. It says, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. There is no time for apathy or complacency. This is the time for vigorous and positive action. And so I want to thank you again. Thank all who joined us. Have a great night. The next stop is in Rochester. That information will be coming out soon. And so we hope that you have a great rest of your evening. Take care.